The next speaker on our program today is going to be looking at the corn hybrid genetic part of this whole issue of corn silage that we're covering today. Dr. John Gazer is a director of nutrition research and innovation at Rock River Labs. John has degrees from the University of Wisconsin at Madison. His master's is in plant breeding and genetics, I guess maybe even in dairy nutrition also, but his PhD in dairy nutrition. Does a lot with forage management, and I look forward to his talk. So John?
Yeah, thank you for the invite and opportunity to contribute to the Penn State Dairy Nutrition Conference. A fantastic and humbling invitation to receive. And today we'll work through an area that's dear to my heart, having a little bit of academic training, as Judge mentioned, and then more so field experience over the last, I guess, 10 to 12 years I've been out of graduate school. I work with the University of Wisconsin still in his adjunct appointment. I also do a bit of private consulting, just to acknowledge this up front, for a couple seed companies and other industry businesses. But the discussion today will be objective, hopefully, and rooted in published research, which we will learn together. So as we look at what I'll work through in the next roughly half hour, I will portray that we should be thinking with cash flow in mind. Then we'll speak about what defines high quality silage. We will get into some discussion of, does genetics even matter? We will get into environment by genotype interaction, hopefully giving you some idea of how to sort through some of the noise, and then come back to hopefully convincing you that it's still all about cash flow and giving you some idea of how we can go about selecting hybrids and then doing comparatives with a partial budget type approach. I've been with Rock River Laboratory roughly 8 years now. Prior to that, I was a practicing nutritionist with a feed company in the upper Midwest, but I've enjoyed my time the last 7 or 8 years working from east to west coast. As you can see, different locations that I've supported, that Rock River Laboratory supports. But I mean to portray here that I've had both domestic, North America, and international experience working with numerous groups, different laboratory clients with Rock River. And what I mean to portray is that whether we are in the United States, North America, South America, Europe, even Western Russia, a lot of what our interests are in selecting the right variety, selecting the right seed corn are shared throughout the world. The seed genetics may be different, but our approach that we will walk through today and discuss some of the implications, it's conserved throughout the world. So it's interesting to recognize that we're focusing here in the Pennsylvania area with a great extension team under Judd and Colleen's lead, and a great conference, but the topics will apply both domestically and internationally. So I'll start with maybe a little bit of an unexpected question, but I'll ask how we might spend $250,000. And I don't necessarily have this in my checkbook to speak from firsthand experience, but I've got a couple examples here of $250,000 expenditures. We've got a used tractor in the upper left-hand corner, and then we've got a 240 acre parcel in Wisconsin, hunting land, northern Wisconsin. And so in either of these cases, if we had $250,000 and we were going to spend on either some equipment or on some land, I think you'd be with me in recognizing we will go through some pretty substantial due diligence before making this purchase, making these investments, either taking a loan out or writing a big check. With the tractor, for example, we may do a test drive. We may run some sort of equipment evaluation. We may ask to see some history of the repair and servicing. With the land, we may look at the title. We may look at some comparables in the area. And I'm actually going through this right now personally with my family, where we're looking at maybe moving or a different property. And we're going through our due diligence, looking at comparatives, trying to understand the value, understanding that $250,000, or in the case, my case, much less than that. But we spend time figuring out what the best avenue forth is with spending $250,000. So what does $250,000 have to do with today? We're talking about seed corn. We're talking about corn silage. And for every 500 cows, what I'll tell you based upon experience and working with partial budgets, for every 500 cows, assuming we're feeding roughly 20 pounds dry matter of corn silage, or roughly 55 to 60 pounds as fed, the value in corn silage to that dairy is $250,000 per year. So this topic came up earlier. I was working with a peer group of dairies earlier in the week, and I was describing how we should go about selecting seed, and they challenged me with a question. They said, gosh, what you're recommending is a lot of work. I said, guys, how many cows are you milking? And then I didn't get a quick answer. I just said, for every 500 cows, you've got $250,000 or $250,000 invested in your corn silage by the end of the year. And I said, that's a boatload of money. It means a lot to your bottom line. And I said, so a little bit of added investment in time and resources should be justifiable, recognizing this kind of economic impact for the herd for every 500 cows. So think about that maybe a little bit differently as I walk through the talk today. So as we look at seed corn and we look at different hybrids, fiber digestibility has gotten a lot of attention, and that falls on this section of this portrayal here. I've used this slide and graphic numerous times in different talks throughout the years, learning from Bill Weiss. But really what we're aiming to do is provide optimal total digestible nutrient levels in the diet, and corn silage provides quite a bit of that. And it comes from the acre in the field to start. But we talk about fiber digestibility, but to get to TDN, it's really a combination of both fiber and starch multiplied by the respective nutrient digestibility that funnels into TDN. So our focus should be more so TDN than fiber digestibility, but fiber digestibility is an influential component of TDN. But today I'm going to talk more in terms of TDN is the outcome, and I look at partial budgets. When we look at what makes up TDN, just looking at the various fractions, this is an image I've adapted from a Hordes article that I wrote earlier in 2020. If we look at total digestible starch in the red and total digestible fiber, so this would be a combination of fiber content, starch content multiplied by their digestibilities, that makes up about 85% of the energetic value or the total digestible nutrient value in corn silage. So really it's all about carbohydrates, and it's a fiber and starch focus within corn silage. And so that's where we should focus our attention. As we look at fiber digestibility, this is a graphic that I presented in 2019 at the Mid-South Ruminant Nutrition Conference. This hasn't undergone peer review, to acknowledge that, but it was the result of a case study, of a field study with an internship, Jared Geiser at that point in 2018, and we surveyed 60 different commercial dairies in eastern Wisconsin. The intention was to look at starch, grain, kernel processing score, but we also had corn silage forage analyses run through Rock River Laboratory. And then we looked at numerous potential comparatives between corn silage quality metrics and then dairy milk production. And so you can see 100 pounds of energy corrected milk denoted about here, and 70 pounds of energy corrected milk denoted here. So these are just the herd performance measures when the samples were taken. And it was striking in that the corn silage, just general forage quality measures in NDFD 30 or Professor Combs TTNDFD or UNDF 240, various fiber digestibility metrics appeared to have some sort of relationship with energy corrected milk production. So I'm not demonstrating cause and effect here, but just interesting correlations. As we look at and reference back to Mike Allen, Masahito Oba, they have a 1999 paper where they much better documented via a well-done research effort, sort of a meta-analysis approach, documenting that a unit improvement in fiber digestibility corresponded to somewhere around a half pound of milk. Well documented, highly cited. In our field survey here, it looked like a unit increase in fiber digestibility may correspond to, say, half to even a pound of milk, or maybe 3/4 of a pound of milk if we look at TT and DFD. So one could almost interpret that to say that dairy cows will respond to a greater extent, if this were real, than they may have 20 years ago. So we know that fiber digestibility is important, and that's one of the reasons we look at it. Moving away from just raw milk and thinking more in terms of efficiency, and we should be thinking with efficiency in mind, whether it be from an acre or from a per cow per day standpoint. Ultimately, we get paid by a hundredweight. And whether it's one cow producing a hundredweight or 1.5 cows producing a hundredweight, what we should be looking at in addition to milk production per cow per day and components is also feed conversion efficiency. So we did that coming out of this internship survey. We have feed conversion efficiency for these 60 herds between 1.3 and 1.7 to 1.8. This would be energy corrected milk divided by dry matter intake. And what we saw was also an interesting relationship potentially between corn silage, fiber digestibility, and feed conversion efficiency, suggesting that the higher the digestible, the higher the quality corn silage cows are more efficient with that. So I hope this is the real case out there, and it can mean 15 to 25 cents per hundredweight in terms of reduction in feed costs if we can gain efficiency. Moving away from anecdotal field studies and now referencing fiber digestibility responses with different hybrid. So genetics does matter. That's, I think, an underlying premise that I'll work with today. The environmental effect is certainly big, which we will discuss a little bit later. But as we look at Luis Ferreira's work published in 2015, Luis has kindly shared with me a couple of slides that I've adapted, and we look at what can play out with looking at, say, a BMR a hybrid versus a conventional hybrid. We recognize substantial differences in fiber digestibility. These are real. The brown midrib mutation, there are numerous mutations out there. I did a little bit of work with this under Professor Jim Coors in graduate school in some wild different genotypes, but the brown midrib mutation is very real and will improve fiber digestibility by reducing UNDF240 or the lignified fiber. It's a quite severe mutation. And it's to the benefit of rumen fiber digestion. But one thing we also need to keep in mind is lignin is also important for plant health in the field. I'm not going to dive into that today, but with a reduction in lignin, we may be at a little bit greater risk for fungal disease pressure, different disease out in the field. So that will be something we need to keep in mind as we look at capturing the most healthy and total digestible nutrient value or yield per acre. As we look at the impact that BMR corn silage can have on milk and performance, it's pretty clearly documented via Luis's meta-analysis. We can have an increase, or we recognize an increase of feed intake by roughly 2 pounds and then milk production by 3 to 4 pounds after his statistical evaluation. Excuse me. The milk production response is often discussed and is used in different partial budgets. But we also need to bear in mind any increase in dry matter intake, because a cost per pound of dry matter might be 8 to 12 cents, depending on the dairy and how much forage we're feeding or what other purchase feeds we have. But this needs to be accounted for in partial budgets as well. So we'll be discussing that. But the point I want to make here is that seed genetics does have an impact. Fiber digestibility, for example, coming along with a brown midrib mutation can yield increased milk. And it may also come with a substantial increase in intake as well. Moving back to some field experience, what I often do in the absence of published literature or looking for more recent data will be to jump onto the Rock River website or work with some other colleagues, hopefully from other forage testing labs, and get an idea of what different samples look like depending upon how they've been labeled. So I know other forage testing labs have similar approaches that they can utilize, but I'll also get questions from nutritionists from time to time asking what we see in this type of feed or this type of feed. And so I tend to use this approach to do that. I log in and I can search for nutritional analyses for different feeds that have been labeled in a certain way. So the very simple one would be to look at samples labeled BMR corn versus everything not labeled BMR. This is a little bit more of a formal report that I had a colleague of mine at Rock River put together, but what this represents is thousands and thousands of samples that we've analyzed at Rock River Laboratory for different nutritive components. And then were they labeled by the farm or the nutritionist or whoever sent them in, say the seed company, were they labeled as BMR? If so, they show the distributions show up in red, or if they were not labeled BMR, then they show up in green or teal. You can tell my colors aren't all that great. So the point I'll make here is very similar to Luis's meta-analysis. We see improvements in fiber digestibility. So if we look at NDF digestibility at 240 hours, this would give us an idea of what the potentially digestible fiber pool looks like. We see the red distribution shifts away from the blue distribution. If we look at Professor Combs' TT-NDFD model, which accounts for UNDF and fiber digestion rate, very similar to what seed and CPS might do within the system, we see separation of roughly 4 to 5 units of total tract NDF digestibility, very similar to what Luis documented in his meta-analyses. So that's one point to take home. We could use these numbers to do some nutrition models and projections if we wanted, but I also want to highlight that there's considerable overlap. So we see this area where samples labeled BMR and those not, there is some overlap in TT-NDFD, for example, or potentially digestible fiber. We do also see a little bit of a difference just moving and taking a step back, recognizing that we have to also account for nutrient level. We see a little bit less starch on samples labeled BMR than we do for those VMR. So again, recognizing that we need to account for fiber content and starch content multiplied by their digestibilities to get the TDN load. Keep this in mind as you work through your evaluations. So fiber digestibility is important. We recognize that. I expect that discussion point will be carried by my colleagues on the panel with the conference. But we also can take a look at starch digestibility, recognizing that for an average dairy cow in the Midwest through the Northeast, Pennsylvania, for example, at a 25 to 28% starch, at say 55 pounds dry matter intake, she's consuming somewhere around 24 to 25 pounds of corn grain equivalent after we take the starch content and adjust it backwards for corn grain. When we look at the average rumen starch digestibility, we see through research around 60 to 65, maybe 70% rumen starch digestibility. So of the 24 pounds of corn grain or of the 15 pounds of starch, there'd be roughly 9 pounds digested in the rumen. By the time we get through the total tract, we have 90+% of starch digested. So if we look strictly at manure, and that's actually one of the areas that I first start when diagnosing performance opportunities, to look at fecal starch in dairy cows. But it wouldn't appear that we have all that much range or all that much opportunity, because we don't typically see much range. It's between 88 and 99% total tract starch digestibility. But when we work back to the rumen, we recognize an average of 9 pounds. But if we look at low versus high rumen starch digestibility on TMR or silages, we recognize considerably more range, say 15 to 20 units in terms of rumen starch digestibility, which could account for 3 or 4 pounds of rumen digestible starch. And what I'll comment is that every pound of rumen digestible starch could contribute enough total digestible nutrient for roughly 3.5 pounds of milk. So we're starting to focus a little bit more on rumen starch digestibility the last few years, now that we have better lab assays out there to understand where we are at with our silage and grain and TMR. Silage grain quality has been documented over a number of years to affect rumen starch digestibility. For example, endosperm characteristics are tied back to rumen starch digestibility. Randy Shaver discussed this in 2013 at the Florida Nutrition Conference. We know that the increasing vitreousness or hardness of grain will depress rumen starch digestibility. So that's fairly well documented. Some newer technology on the market via an amylase trait expressed in the endosperm. This is intriguing to me. I'll leave it at that. There are a couple now ADSA published abstracts, Welsh et al., Rebello et al., documenting some of the potential responses through controlled studies. So this is an interesting area, but I put a question mark here, given that I think there's quite a bit yet left for us to understand around how a corn hybrid expressing amylase may affect performance and feed conversion. We know that kernel processing has a strong impact on rumen starch digestibility, total tract starch digestibility. So work with your custom harvesters. We're past that time now, but understand what your kernel processing score is, and then work to achieve upwards of 75 to 80% now. We're seeing the top 15% of farms out there in silages hit 78 to 80% KPS. So certainly one thing to monitor. And then there's been some discussion that, well, rumen starch digestibility initially with green chopped corn or maybe poor kernel processing isn't all that important, because through ensiling and fermentation, that will sort of cure all ills. And so ensiling and fermentation certainly increases rumen starch digestibility. We see that here. These are corn silage samples analyzed by numerous laboratories under the Rock River family over the last 2 years. And we see a drop off in rumen starch digestibility around new crop. So this is green chopped corn or freshly chopped silage. And we see, regardless of location, rumen starch digestibility, that's what we have graphed on the y-axis here, it increases within 2 to 3 months. And then it plateaus somewhere around 80 to 85%. But what I want to point out is even after 6 to 8 months of fermentation, we still see a wide spread in rumen starch digestibility on corn silage samples. So at some level, I wonder, can ensiling or fermentation really cure all? My opinion is no. Will certainly improve, but if we have very poorly digesting starch, poor kernel processing score, I don't know that that's going to fix things by just letting it cook out for 6 or 8 months. Looking at some published research, and now this comes out of another one of Luis's slide decks. Here we're looking at in vitro starch digestibility of corn grain, I believe, in that we have a very, very moderate rumen starch digestibility here, in vitro 7-hour starch tea. But here, Luis documented how we have 2 different hybrids with an inherent difference in rumen starch digestibility after 30 days of ensiling. and then letting these ferment out for 120 or even 240 days. Here we're looking at 6 months of fermentation, and there was still a difference in rumen starch digestibility between these two different hardness levels. So here is at least some published research documenting that while grain digestibility when freshly ensiled can be different, fermentation does not necessarily bring these together after 6 months of ensiling. I'll transition now to speaking a little bit about the environmental effects. I know Joe Lawrence with Cornell and others have done great work in this area, looking at trying to understand what impact really does genotype or hybrid have relative to the growing conditions and environment. And so first, to acknowledge the growing conditions, environment, Mother Nature, she presents a huge impact on resulting forage quality. But I also will reference some work with Joe Lauer, and as recently this week, speaking with him, genetics does matter. We certainly shouldn't ignore heritability, or excuse me, seed genetics, because what Joe has commented that corn hybrids and quality associated with corn hybrids is repeatable. This is a table from one of Joe Lauer's publications. This was in 2011, and he documented repeatability. And what this stands for is how a hybrid ranked in a plot relative to its cohorts. And this is the percentage of a time that a high quality hybrid ranked high or a low quality hybrid ranked low. And so we can see very high repeatability estimates, 95, 98% for fiber digestibility. So what that suggests is that a hybrid ranking high in NDFD or to the higher end for fiber and starch ratios will rank high relative to peers in other plots. So this is one indication that I've used that seed genetics, or one reference that I've used to indicate, look, seed genetics is very important, and we don't have interactions that are completely washed out by Mother Nature. Another way that we can look at the genotype by environment interaction is going back to the BMR versus not BMR data set from Rock River that I used before, but now rather than looking at all years lumped together and looking at distributions, we actually have the average results for each of the different feed sample types then by crop year. And I've highlighted just starch content here so we can see that there is a consistent difference. In this case, it is BMR numerically less than conventional, or I guess I should say not BMR labeled samples in starch content, but that some years it's very close, other years it's further apart. So this details the environmental effect because the seed genetics will be relatively consistent perhaps in this period of time, but when we see say a deviation or a coalescing of the difference between these two, this is an example of the environmental effect. So we see some consistency, but we also see the effect of Mother Nature in the growing environment. Speaking to managing the environment, and this is an area where I've sought to understand more. I've put my hat on. I was commenting earlier with Judd and the organizing team that we have a lot that we stand to gain yet in understanding how we manage the plants from the point we put the seed in the ground, and probably the soil fertility prior to that, how that relates to forage quality. As I dug into literature in the past week, putting the content together for this talk, I recognized there's not as much out there as I would have hoped in terms of soil fertility, which I'll speak to on the next slide. But one thing I did come across is that, and this is what this slide documents, I've adapted this from Joe Lauer, is we look at corn plant populations from 20,000 to 50,000 plants per acre. This has been repeatedly found to have an impact on forage quality. So we will certainly increase forage yield the more seeds we put in the ground per acre. So as we move from 30 to 50,000, somewhat of a linear response here. We've got two different genotypes represented in this plot from Joe. But as we look at fiber digestibility, we see maybe a slight decrease in fiber digestibility with the BMR, but a pretty big impact, negative impact in fiber digestibility in vitro NDFT as we look at the normal hybrids here. And as we look at milk per ton, which takes into account fiber digestibility and also starch content, we see decreases in energy value per ton of silage. So one thing from a management standpoint, as I work with growers, I think it's going to be probably in our best interests to be perhaps backing populations off below 45, below 40,000 plants per acre if we're chasing optimal forage quality, total digestible nutrient yield per pound or per ton or per acre. Some of the other references I found, and I'll move through this very quickly. As I mentioned, there's not as much out there as I would have thought. As I looked at irrigation or moisture, and this is very different from the environmental effect of rainwater, but Antonio Gallo and his group in Italy performed a couple studies where they reduced water in an effort to save water and save moisture. They saw little to a negative effect when when they reduced irrigation. This would be a little bit different than I might expect if we would endure a drought situation. So I'm not certain what to think on the moisture front. As I looked at fertility, numerous studies documented nitrogen application effect or lack of effect on corn silage quality. And so Craig Schaefer at the University of Minnesota put together a nice study in an agronomy journal. Didn't see any impact of nitrogen fertilization on NDFD for several different hybrids. We do recognize that nitrogen fertilization will result in harder kernels, as documented by Sabata and Mason. So the more nitrogen we put down, it may be to the benefit of, say, grain yield or perhaps total tonnage, but we will end up with likely a little bit harder grain, a little bit higher crude protein content in the grain, and maybe a little bit less starch digestibility. Phosphorus, not entirely certain what to make there. And then I did find one reference when we look at potassium. I may be making a stretch here, but in 1974, this group recognized that added potassium, when they separated the stover from the grain, recognized added potassium at the soil level resulted in less lodging, increased rind thickness, and increased crushing strength in stover. So I wonder, is added K perhaps reducing NDFD? But very little research in this area, and I think this is an area where we stand much opportunity, much research yet to be done. So let's talk about selecting hybrids as I wrap up, hopefully in the next 5 to 7 minutes. What I've found is that many dairies, many growers don't put together probably as good of a program as they could. So as I make recommendations, there are really 2 or 3 steps to putting together a seed selection program. The first being step 1, enroll hybrids. I would suggest benchmarking with your current hybrids, always including your current year's hybrids in the following year's plots, and then inviting other prospective hybrid or seed companies to contribute in. Seek out collaboration, find people to help. I know a dairy owner and manager and yourselves as nutritionists, if you're watching this, you've got a lot going on, but if we team up, different people can kick in and help out with different aspects of the plot. I think we can generate a lot of value. Perhaps it makes sense to run a peer group where we have the nutritionist, agronomist, seed advisors, and maybe across multiple sites come together and put together some plots. There's an interesting couple case studies I'll reference. So there's actually one group I know of, multi-site dairy group, that they make it a requirement that any seed company that will come in and work with their group enrolls prospective hybrids in their plot evaluation and program. So I think this is the way of the future for progressive dairies. There's just too much money on the line. Margins are too thin. $250,000 investment for every 500 cows. So I look at us putting together sort of a grading scheme year in, year out to identify the top performing hybrids. And the progressive dairies out there are doing just that. Last week in discussion, just took a random phone call asking about how to evaluate seed corn and understand forage analyses. But I spoke with Joseph Ribeiro, and he invited me to share this story, this anecdote. He told me and let me know how he puts a targeted plot program together each year. What he does is he enrolls 8 hybrids to start the year, works with his agronomist to monitor performance, emergence, standability, and then whittles that down to 4 hybrids where he does more intense nutritional sampling and analysis. What he does is he takes then 3 samples per hybrid and averages the results, and then he looks at those 4 hybrids. I think this is another pretty good way to go about evaluating seed genetics on your farm with sort of a replicated approach. So assuming we decide to put plots in the ground, work with hopefully collaborators, we need to get the plot done. And then at the end of the year, we need to recognize that yield and quality are not as easily estimated from the plot. In the case of yield, learning from Jill Lauer earlier this week, we can get a lot of information on quality from a farm level plot, but yield is probably a little bit more difficult, because while I was explaining that quality is fairly well conserved from year to year, plot to plot, meaning the high-ranking hybrids are going to be high relative to their peers. That's not to say that quality will always be high or always be low, but I'm saying it will shift up and down in that peer group. But yield, here's where Joe comments that there's a little bit more in interaction. So the way that we can overcome this is to take several locations or maybe plant hybrids in a few different spots within your farm, and then taking the yield estimates from there. So I recognize this is not as easily done. There are ways we can get around it by working with other sources of information, but quality, we do need a little bit more replication than we do for quality. In terms of quality, I am recommending, of course, I work for a forage testing lab, and I know the others out there will agree with me, other forage testing labs, I mean, take this with a grain of salt, but I recommend a minimum of 3 forage analyses per hybrid. And this isn't necessarily to document the single hybrid performance, but it's recognizing that there is an amount of sampling error at the farm level, and then to less extent at the lab level. I put this graphic up just to show, as Rock River, one thing that we repeatedly do is to monitor subsampling consistency. And what we've recognized is that up to 1.5 units of corn silage NDF, that's acceptable when looking at 2 different subsamples of the samples submitted to the lab. So this is just for a single subsample. On average, it's much less than that, less than 1 unit of NDF between different subsamples, because when you as a nutritionist or a farmer send in, say, 1 or 2 pounds corn silage to the laboratory, Rock River or the other laboratories out there, they'll only use probably a 1/4 pound of that, meaning they use 1/4 to 1/8 of what you send into the laboratory. So there will be some inherent subsampling here, but corn silage is an inherently heterogeneous material to sample. And so that's why I recommend coming back here 3 forage analyses, so that we can take those, and there will inevitably be a little bit of difference between the 3, but take those results and average them, and then use those within your partial budget approaches. So hopefully, after orchestrating a plot, working with your collaborators on your farm, then we can get to a point where we have yield estimates. We can work with a nutritionist to estimate total digestible nutrient value, and we can estimate total digestible nutrient yield per acre, and then hopefully rank them out, assuming we have fairly similar dry matters of maturity. And then what I like to do is take that farm level hybrid ranking, and then combine and sort of cross-reference against a seed company or a seed advisor's recommendations and the valuable university or independent trials. There are numerous independent trials out there. I work closely with Joe at the University of Wisconsin. PDMP, I know, has a very good trial, the first trials. But what I've got detailed here is just a theoretical example of on the farm how we might have hybrids, and this would be ranking from high to low. So hybrid K was number 1, D was number 2, and B was number 3. However, if we would cross-reference these hybrids through a couple other sources at the seed company level, they might recognize, assuming we're working all with the same seed company, that hybrid K was actually 3rd on their list. So that represents then a difference between our plot and what a seed company would recommend. Why the difference? Well, the seed company is going to have far more replication, a lot more information. And if we look at the university hybrid trials, they can hopefully be, say, the deciding vote. Here in this case, hybrid K, despite being the high-ranking top one at the farm level, it's actually middle of the pack. And then when we look at just kind of high ranking, if we say, rather than, all right, we're going to take the top one, what if we take the top half or the top third? And if they are, if a hybrid is within this top third to top half, we consider that kind of high ranking. Well, now we recognize hybrid B is in the top third of all 3 of those. So hybrid B becomes the clear winner here. And this is the approach that I like to do. I think back to some of my time coming out of graduate school, working with dairies, multi-site dairies that had come together. And this was the approach we took to identify the top ranking genetics out there and ensure ourselves a greater chance for success. So when we do that, we hopefully have identified hybrids that will capture the optimal amount of total digestible yield per acre, yet that should hopefully be translated into increased milk production per cow per day, increased efficiency. And unfortunately, though, I think there are a few more considerations to our partial budget approach. And as I've looked at, say, hybrid A versus hybrid B, or as people have asked me about my thoughts about various hybrids, if we have, say, brown midder versus conventional, we can pretty readily recognize that there's more milk potential in the seed corn with the brown midder mutation. But does that cash flow out? Because 4 pounds of milk can look attractive. If we're talking about 60 to 80 cents return, or I should say gross income through more milk. But what does that mean in terms of increased intakes? What are the crop production costs per acre? Do we have robust yield estimates? Do we need actually more acreage to feed the herd if the cows are all of a sudden consuming a little bit more? What is key feed conversion efficiency? And what impact does that increased quality have on the rest of the diet? These are some of the areas or gaps that I've seen, and Randy Shaver and I have seen a couple other partial budget approaches have an opportunity to maybe be a little bit more robust. So Randy and I set out, I guess, a year or 2 years ago at this point. We put together with our University of Wisconsin hats on a seed corn evaluation tool. It's titled Corn BMR Silage Milk Yield Calculator. It can be downloaded. It's available from the University of Wisconsin Extension at corn.agronomy.wisc.edu. It's an Excel worksheet. You can work through. You can plug in different hybrids side by side. I've just got a case study here to detail how this thing is put together and the necessary inputs. We've got hybrid A versus hybrid B. Here, this is starting with milk production information from Luis Ferreira's and Randy Shaver's meta-analyses. This is simply information to start from. I would strongly encourage you to plug in your own estimates of what hybrid A versus hybrid B might yield in terms of milk production, dry matter intake, feed conversion efficiency. You can plug in current component prices so that we have a real portrayal of what revenue is on a per cow per day basis. You can plug in the number of cows, and then there's also a highlighted area within the worksheet to sit down with the grower, with your producer, with the agronomist, the seed consultant, and get an idea of what crop production costs are per acre. I find that many growers don't have these numbers nailed down, but this is a critical component to putting together a cash flow projection on evaluating two different hybrids. We may have an idea that hybrid A or B may give us more milk, but we need to also take into account the yield and then the cost of that yield per acre and the cost of production, the crop production cost per acre. And we reference an Iowa State worksheet that details all the inputs that need to be put together here. This is a great tool that then can not only help us fully account for the cost of the silage, but help us put together a fairly straightforward cash flow projection to look at if we plant hybrid B, what will be the net response for the cow or for the herd on a given year. So hopefully you can go out and get access to this worksheet, download it, and find some utility from it. I know Rick Grant, the Minor Institute, they have a worksheet. Michigan State has the Corn Picker worksheet as well. So there are numerous different resources out there, just to give appropriate credit to other examples out there. But I've obviously got a little bit of bias, given that Randy Shaver, Bruce Jones, Joe Lauer, and I put our heads together via University of Wisconsin Extension, put this one together. So with that said, a couple minutes passed, maybe longer than what I anticipated, but I look forward to carrying some discussion. I've got a list of the references that I can provide via a PDF share of this after the fact via the conference. But if you'd like to reach out to me directly, please send me an email. If you've got my mobile number, shoot me a text or a phone call. But I would look forward to carrying the discussion. And again, I appreciate the opportunity to come in and contribute.
Oh, well, thank you very much, John. Really interesting. Let me start off with one. I've not used your spreadsheet from Wisconsin, but my question is, does anyone put in the spreadsheets, if I tell a farmer you need to store that silage 4 to 6 months before you start using it, does anyone put in any cost of storing that? I mean, you've got a huge amount of money in the bank there to have 4 to 6 months worth of silage just fermenting.
Right.
Does anyone account for that?
Oh, not that I have seen. That's not to say it doesn't exist, but if we've got $250,000 sunk into our crop year for every 500 cows, and if we want to let it ferment for 6 months before we get into feeding it out, that may be $125,000 investment that we just have sitting on concrete or sitting on blacktop, hopefully not on the dirt, or in bags. And that money is not going to be gaining interest. It's not going to be in the bank. We're not necessarily able to put it to use. Now, one could counter that argument, recognizing that we are, in a sense, gaining in nutritive value per pound. So we are, in a sense, getting a return on our investment, in that the starch digestibility in particular, it won't affect fiber digestibility, but the starch digestibility will increase over that period of time. But no, I've not seen a robust cash flow projection and decision-making tool that incorporates that length of time and silage.
Yeah, to see if the increase, where's a cutoff of where that increased digestibility doesn't pay for itself because of the
Sure.
interest cost
Yeah.
of all
Yeah.
that money.
Yep. No, I get the question, as I know you do. How long should we let silage ferment? In my experience, working with a few dairies as part of a multi-site group, they've made the decision to ferment it for 12 to 18 months. But the cash layout for that is substantial.
Yeah.
So I don't know how I would justify that from a return on investment.
Yeah. Any other questions? Tom's on.
Yeah, I was struggling to unmute. Sorry about that. So I guess my question, my first question is along that same line. Farmers pretty much recognize that those first 2 to 3 months, especially, digestibility of starch is not all that good, and fiber digestibility too. So we hear claims about a variety of different things that you can put on corn silage at the time of ensiling that supposedly enhances digestibility of fiber, but then especially starch. Those first couple of months, is there any evidence out there to say that there are things that farmers can add that have a good track record of improving digestibility during that time?
Oh, good and heavy question. I'm going to take the academic approach and say it depends, but there would be a couple approaches to putting some sort of additive onto a whole plant chaff forage that would end up being silage. So we've got bacterial inoculants. We would have a directly applied acid or chemical, and then we would have enzymes. Those would be maybe 3 different classes. And bacterial inoculants can certainly produce enzymes as well, many different enzymes, proteolysis, for example, is a known effect with many microbial inoculants. So I guess I would recommend a bacterial inoculant first and foremost from a feed preservation standpoint in optimizing dry matter recovery. And it wasn't the focal point today, but we're recognizing more and more feed hygiene, gut health issues attributable to just a little bit off fermentation. So that's not directly addressing your question, Tom. I'm going about it in a little bit roundabout way. So I would recommend a bacterial inoculant from a crop protection or insurance standpoint. But in terms of documenting responses on starch digestibility or fiber digestibility, Karen Bushman work in groups out of Canada have looked at a number of different strategies. And I believe if my recollection of literature is correct, there can be situations where, say, an enzyme applied can have a response in terms of improving starch digestibility, maybe to a lesser extent fiber digestibility, because it will be different enzymes that will attack and go after the fiber versus the starch. Starch digestibility, recognizing that it will improve with ensiling upwards of 12 to 18 months. Could there be an interaction where some sort of enzyme would speed up the process, so to speak? I referenced the seed genetics that actually expresses amylase in the endosperm, in the kernel. That concept, that technology is intriguing. Admittedly, I work with them, so I'll stop short of maybe going any further into it than that. But I look forward to some research being published via peer review and the industry getting a handle there. But on the fiber side, I would say not as much. On the starch side, perhaps, but there's not a clear-cut path or a clear body of research documenting one way or another.
Okay, thank you. And then I have another question, if I may, going maybe to the agronomy side of things. When we're growing corn, we tend to treat every hybrid the same from a fertility, nutrient requirement standpoint. Are they pretty much the same, or is there any evidence to suggest that certain hybrids might need slightly different, or might have slightly different nutrient requirements than other hybrids? And I guess I'm thinking in terms of maybe BMR versus conventional, but even within conventional hybrids, is there any thought behind that?
That's a really good question, forward thinking. So I won't be able to put my thumb on the reference. It's probably published or printed and sitting on my desk somewhere as I was ruffling through papers for the talk. But there will be interactions. So there will be certain hybrids that will respond differently to, say, some changes in fertility or plant disease relative to others. So I don't know that we understand via published literature what those ramifications are, what those interactions are. Here's where I come back to putting a plug in for the seed advisors, seed consultants, seed companies, and agronomists as well, that just via experience better understand how certain hybrids may respond in different situations, given their experience with many different growers and probably across a number of years with different sets of genetics. So I know that to be a real factor, Tom. I just don't know that I can speak to this hybrid or this set of genetics versus this one, what the response might be. You'd asked or you'd portrayed, say, BMR versus conventional. I'll come back to the plant disease standpoint, again, recognizing that lignin is one of the plant defense mechanisms as the plant grows and is hopefully healthy in the field. So with a reduced ability to lignify, reduced lignification, that does predispose the plant to perhaps a little bit be affected a little bit more if we have, say, ear or stalk rot coming in. So in that case, I think it's a little bit better accepted that we would step up our efforts in crop protection in the case of fungicide, for example, to push back fungal pathogens.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, I appreciate it very much, John. This is clearly one of those topics that we're going to be learning a lot more about and have to keep working at for years as things change.
Absolutely.
Can I just ask one more quick question? So you talked about the plant population, and if I caught that correctly, that fiber digestibility was decreased as plant population was increased. Do you have any explanation for that? What's going on?
Yeah, this may be a bit of speculation and conjecture on my behalf, but it may have to do with leaf area relative to, say, stover. So in the case of alfalfa, it's pretty clear cut. Leaves are very, very, very digestible, and the stem is much less digestible. So the more leaf we have, the more crude protein we have, the more digestible fiber we have. I think the similar concept plays out with seed corn. So if we have, say, plants that are stuck closer and closer together, I don't know if they just end up with more stover, more lignified mass, maybe a little bit less leaf to yield and hang on and put a big old ear out there, because we know that plant populations in the case of grain corn, I mean, we'll push 50,000 plants per acre for optimal. I don't know what it's optimal for greater grain yields, but that comes at the detriment of fiber digestibility. So that would be my thought. That would be my speculation, that it has to do with the leaf relative to the stover or a little bit more woody portion of the fiber.
Okay. Any more questions before we? Okay. Well, once again, I thank you very much for working with us this year, and hopefully next year or subsequent years, we'll see you in person.
Yeah, I look forward to it. Thanks again for the invitation.
All right. Thanks again.
Bye.